operation. So this is everything that I grew up with. You know, white mold and SDS were the two biggest issues that we saw year in and year out growing up. And I got a really great opportunity to keep doing this kind of work during a PhD at University of Wisconsin, as Horacio said. So I worked there with Dr. Damon Smith, who is also very heavily into white mold. It's a very consistent issue up in Wisconsin. So because of that, this was one of the most pressing issues that we dealt with. Since then, about a year and a half ago, took a position up at North Dakota State up in Fargo. And what I thought Wisconsin was very high white mold pressure, I've come to learn that it was very small compared to what we deal with up here in the Great Plains. White mold is absolutely devastating, as I'm sure that you all have seen this past season, at least from what Horacio has told me about what you all saw this past year. We had fields that were almost 80, probably 75 to 80% stand loss because of white mold alone. And we'll show a few pictures here of those kind of instances, I guess, or case studies. So with that, I guess I'll just jump right into kind of where we're at. So I'm going to do kind of break this up into two different parts. Hopefully we can kind of make this more of a discussion than it is me just kind of talking to an empty black box in my desk here. But so we're going to be talking about the identification of white mold, understanding the entire disease cycle from a biological standpoint, and then we're going to jump into management. Thankfully, and I will say this right off the bat, that there are a lot of other individuals at a lot of universities that have done a lot of work on white mold. So what I'm presenting here is some of my work, but it's also some of many other people's work as well. So again, this is a whole team effort to get to where we are with white mold at the moment. So, you know, from a large perspective across the entire Midwest or the entire soybean growing region, we come together every year as pathologists, Horacio and I and our colleagues, and we put together our estimates as far as yield loss associated for each disease in every given year. And so, you know, consistently, white mold is one of the top diseases. It is not going to be as yield reducing as what soybean cyst may be, but very consistently in the top 4 or 5 of these 4 years here. Okay, again, indicating that this is across the board very impactful. And so just a little bit of a summary, and this is kind of what I'm showing all my growers as well, just kind of a recap of 2023 in our area. We had very high areas of white mold, especially within the central portions of the state. You know, we had a pretty severe drought throughout most of the year, but for whatever reason, this central section got very timely rains right around flowering period, which is what drove this infection or these epidemics in these areas. And that moisture, because of these rainfalls, helped develop these what we call the apothecia or the white mold mushrooms, which drive this infection, producing these spores leading to disease development. Okay. And you can see here, this is one of the fields here. There were pockets right here in which we had about 50% stand loss due to white mold in this low-lying region of this field. And these are these apothecia that are being produced that's driving the infections, creating these ascospores, causing the initial infections. And we'll go into each of these bits individually. So white mold at the very basic level is just a fungus. It's very similar to the mushrooms that we eat in the store. They have strong networks of what we call mycelia that grow, and this is what forms that white mold or the white growth on those plants. Okay, so this is a fungus, making sure we are using fungicides for some of these for control. Just understanding that is good. And then the other important part about white mold is that the pathogen Sclerotinia is able to infect and cause disease in over 600 different plant species. So in some other diseases, you know, Phytophthora and soybean cyst, those are very host specific, meaning that they only infect into soybeans. White mold can infect many different crops and primarily everything that's a broadleaf, so not corn and small grains, and everything else can be infected. White mold is very dependent on the weather, so it needs very cool temperatures and very wet, prolonged conditions in order for these apothecia to form, and then subsequently high humidity for the disease to develop. The other difficult part about this, just as a general takeaway here, is that white mold survives a very long time in an environment. So it does form what we call sclerotia, and these sclerotia can persist for up to 10 years in a given field, potentially even longer. But those kind of experiments and trials are very difficult to complete. So beginning within the disease cycle of white mold, this fungus survives over winters using these sclerotia, and these sclerotia are kind of their hibernation strategy. So at the end of the growing season, the fungus will produce these hard structures, and it'll shut down and go to sleep until it wakes up. It gets the correct environment, it gets the right crop, and then it'll start to produce these apothecia again. So as I said, 5 to 10 years, these sclerotia are capable of surviving, and primarily the reason that they become no longer viable is through microbial degradation. So the microbes, the bacteria, and other fungi in the soil will start to eat away at these sclerotia. So for management of these sclerotia, it can be very important trying to encourage other good beneficial bacteria and fungi within that soil environment to eat away these sclerotia. It's also been shown that the sclerotia size is really important when determining the amount of spores that are produced. So very small, weak sclerotia, okay, are going to produce very few and very small of these apothecia, where the large ones are going to produce many, many apothecia together, and many of them are going to be viable. So they're going to produce a lot of spores. So once these sclerotia start to form apothecia here, so these are the little tan white mold mushrooms. They kind of are like an inverted cup, and most often they're laying flat on the surface of that soil. So you can see here next to that dime, one, how small they are, okay, compared to a dime, and then also that they are laying very close to the ground. They're not sticking up as some other of the mushrooms do that we commonly think of. These also form in clumps, as you can see. There are multiple of these apothecia forming from the same sclerotia. And so for these to form, we need primarily 3 different environmental conditions. Say cool temps, so anything between 50 to 75. And we've seen that this is primarily driven by the nighttime temperatures. So if we see the nighttime temps dropping down into the 50s and 60s, especially around that flowering period of soybeans, then this is when I start to get a little concerned about white. Additionally, soil moisture is going to be very important. These mushrooms need that water to wake up and to grow these apothecia. And so that prolonged soil conditions is going to be important. So whether that be a heavy rainfall, continual dew that's forming every morning, or heavy fog, those are all conditions that are conducive for these apothecia to form. And then the last one is going to be shade. So these apothecia, they require a very specific light wavelength quality, and that's typically found when we get canopy closure. So they needed a little bit of shaded environment. And so as soon as canopy closure is occurring is when we can assume that these apothecia are going to be forming. Okay, so that is going to be important when thinking about some management strategies, especially with fungicide applications. And we'll get into that too, okay? So when identifying these apothecia, there are a few other species of fungi that are very commonly misidentified. The most important one here is the bird's nest fungi. They both look like this inverted cup, but the big difference here is that these bird's nest fungi are typically going to grow on corn residue, as you can see in these images here. But this fungi, the bird's nest fungi, are what we call a saprotroph. So they eat away at the degrading plant tissue, where the apothecia are growing out of the sclerotia. These bird's nest fungi, very, very cool, the way that they look with these little eggs, okay? You will see the eggs present in the bird's nest fungi, but you will not see them within the apothecia, okay? So very important if you go out to the field trying to find these mushrooms, these are going to be good key diagnostic factors for this. The next part, once we have those apothecia, these apothecia release pus of spores. So you can see this image down here. A plate was removed. These are growing in Petri plates, and giant bursts of spores are being released. Most oftentimes, these spores are released due to what we call a decrease in the moisture tension. So essentially, it's the dew. If there's dew laying in that canopy, as soon as it starts to dry, we see that water residual on the top of these apothecia get removed. It forces these spores to burst out of the apothecia. And this is a really cool video here taken while we were at Wisconsin. So you can see clearly right there, those apothecia releasing ascospores, and each one of those apothecia can release up to 1 million spores. And so imagine this entire plate here, there are probably more than 50 individual apothecia present. So 50 million or more spores being released, each one of these spores having the potential to cause an individual infection. So you can see how even a single apothecia can lead to a large epidemic within a field. So take that over a field scale, and we have sclerotia present throughout. We can see a large number or a very few sclerotia leading to a large number of disease incidences within a particular field. After these spores are released, the next part is going to be the infection. So infection will not occur throughout the entire season. It will only be around this flowering period. And that's primarily because these ascospores, they require dying plant tissue, specifically flower tissue. So as soon as those flowers are starting to dry up and fall off, we start to see the pin pods start to develop. That's when these ascospores are going to be able to establish themselves and infect into that plant tissue. And so I'm sure that many of you understand the reproductive growth stages of soybeans, but just for clarification here, okay, the R1 growth stage is right when we see any node on that plant having a single flower on it, okay? R2 is what we call full flowering. So we see flowers over that entire main stem, typically within the upper two most nodes we see flowers present. R3 is when we see these pin pods start to develop on these, okay, very small. The flower tissue will oftentimes be stuck on the very end of these pods. And then R4 is when these pods are starting to develop and elongate. So as long as there are flower tissue, senescing, drying flower tissue, these spores can still cause infection, okay? Now, once infection does occur, it does take a little bit of time to see this infection. So even though we don't see it present for 2 to 3 weeks, that fungus is still growing within that plant. It's eating away at it, and it's causing destruction. But after we get that period in which the ascospores are no longer being released, control such as fungicide applications are no longer going to be effective, okay? So even though we may not see it, okay, or even after we see it, fungicides are no longer going to be an effective option because that initial infection occurred 2 to 3 weeks prior to that. Once this infection does occur, we do see this white mycelia, okay, or the fungal growth where the name white mold comes from, start to develop. Then we see this stem tissue from what used to be very dark green starting to turn a pale white or bleaching in color. That's primarily because the fungus is killing off that plant tissue, and then that plant is no longer able to support the chlorophyll within each of those cells, leading to plant death. Once this infection has kind of reached its used all of the resources available, the fungus will begin to shut down, start to hibernate, and produce these new sclerotia, as you can see on the edge of this stem tissue. And then after, and if this occurs, so it girdles the entire stem, we will eventually see plant death leading to, or due to premature wilting, which we see here. This was a particular field that we saw this past year. Along this tree line, again, they had extra shade during portions of the day, leading to increased moisture and humidity, leading to this destructive development of white mold in this particular field here. So once these sclerotia are developed, or once the fungus starts to reach its edge of the food that it's able to eat, it forms these sclerotia. We see this here on a petri plate of growing out sclerotia. The fungus will grow continuously, and as soon as it senses, say, hey, I've run out of food, let's shut down and form these sclerotia. On the previous slide, we showed the sclerotia forming on the outside of the stem, but they also form on the inside within that pith tissue. It will replace it, as we can see in here. This is where some of the residue is left over from the sclerotia, okay? But other sclerotia can also get taken out in the grain. So we can see in this image here, and some of these sclerotia are quite significantly large. And so the sclerotia in the grain can lead to a lot of discounts at the elevators as well, leading to greater economic losses too. So as kind of a summary here, just putting everything together from what we just looked at for the identification portion of this. The sclerotia survive in that topsoil. Okay, they need to be within about 2 centimeters or so of that topsoil in order to form these apothecia. So they need environmental conditions, again, prolonged environment, which is cool, moist, and shaded. We need infection into these flower tissues. So again, around these reproductive R1 to R3 growth stages. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks for infection to occur, to see the symptoms. And then the sclerotia starts to develop after that, being released back into the field after harvest, okay? And so how exactly, now that we understand this, how exactly is this going to cause any yield loss associated with white mold? And so this is a picture that we took a few years ago of a particular, field that research trials. Okay, and I pulled it out of the grain bin here. But first, you can see these sclerotia again present, and so these are causing a lot of issues, discounts at the elevator, contamination, and it's also replacing a lot of these seeds that are trying to be developed. You also see some of these poorly formed seeds, reduced quality of them. These plants are weak. They're no longer able to completely fill these grain. And then we're also seeing what we call the mummies, or the seeds that have been dried up. We see a white chalky substance on the outside, which is again more of that fungal mycelia. And these are going to, in combination with the sclerotia, the smaller seeds, and the mummies, okay, we're going to see some reduced yields across the board due to white mold. So again, this is everything that I just said. We also see reduced oil content, and so I know oil is one of these traits that are being heavily bred for in recent years. And so because of white mold, we do see reduced oil. In some cases, we do see increased protein. So there's a shift within those plants due to white mold. Also, if anyone's growing for seed, and I'm sure many of you are not in your location, but if you are, white mold can also lead to lower germination rates again because of that mycelia, potential fungus growing in that seed, okay? So we're at management now. That was kind of the very quick introduction to the identification. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of what do we do now that we have it. And so again, if anyone does have questions, please chime in. I'd love to have discussions on the identification, things you saw, things you just don't know about, or questions about.
Wait, when is the best time that you go to scout for these apothecia, and is it worth doing that?
Yeah, so in order to scout for them, the best time is going to be around that flowering. So as soon as you start to see flowers, you can go out and look. Specifically, when you see canopy closure, if you know you have a field with white mold present, then those are going to be the times when to look. Whether or not it's important to do, I think that it's the management strategies most likely are not going to change based off of this because you saw how many spores are being released. But it is something that if you want to go out and visually confirm that, hey, we are seeing these apothecia. If these apothecia are present, you're more than likely to see disease develop in those particular fields. But probably, again, so around the flowering and canopy closure are going to be that time.
Hey, wait, this is Lee Beers. I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was out grabbing some cores of soil for Horacio, but I noticed that there's some apothecia present in the fall. Have you seen that in North Dakota, or is that just kind of a fluke where we got the perfect growing conditions, cloudy weather, and it caused some of those apothecia to pop up in the fall?
Yeah, yep, that's exactly right. So you absolutely can see that. That's one of the benefits of using some cover crops and corn as well. We can kind of trigger some of these apothecia germ or to carpogenically or produce the apothecia outside of that flowering period, and that's good that you're seeing that because when those sclerotia are utilizing and using up all of their energy to produce these apothecia, but there's no soybeans to infect, then they're kind of running out, killing themselves off. So that's great that you saw that. Again, these cover crops, different weedy species in the spring can also kind of trigger this conditioning, this development of non-viable apothecia, I guess.
Other questions?
I have another one. Wait, so you show that those grains all contaminated with sclerotia, right? Is it any problem when we then later plant those same seeds that came from, contaminated beans and?
Yeah, yep, exactly. So for two reasons, again, because of the mummies that you saw, those seeds are most likely not going to germinate because of the sclerotinia on that seed. But those sclerotinia are going to wake up and start to infect other surrounding seeds, and they could actually produce sclerotia on top of that, which could lead to more development of apothecia. If you're actively planting some sclerotia, you could actually also lead to developmental white mold. That's one of the ways that we as pathologists inoculate some of our trials sometimes. So if you wanted white mold problems, that would be a good way to do it.
So those mummy seeds, I always want to say mummy berry from blueberry, but mummy seeds, can those cause ascospores? So if we think about our cleanings, if we spread those on the field to get rid of them, can that cause increased infection rates?
So yeah, yes, but not in a direct way. So what can happen is that the fungus, so sclerotinia will use and eat up the seed tissue, I guess, and they will form their new sclerotia within that soil. Those new sclerotia can then be used to create these apothecia. So it is a process. I would still not recommend spreading out those seeds, regardless of if have mummies or if they come from fields that have had severe infections, just because of the potential for that.
Okay, thanks.
What do you see on the corn stalk?
What was the question?
The mushrooms that you see on the corn stalks, I see that quite often.
Mushrooms on the corn stalks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bird's nest fungi, yeah.
So
Any concerns we should have? Is that the question? We should have any concern when we see that?
Yeah.
Any concerns we should have when we see that? Wait.
Oh, the bird's nest?
Yeah.
No. So the bird's nest fungi, they grow pretty readily, meaning that they are not as picky as the white mold apothecia are. So it's good that you see the bird's nest fungi because one, that fungus is breaking down that corn material, so it's putting organic matter back into the soil. So from a soil health perspective, that's great. But if you do see them, there could be potential of these apothecia forming too. So again, if you see them outside of this canopy closure and flowering, then that's fantastic. But if you do see them probably within that period, then you may want to consider making an application in those fields if you have white mold history.
Well, like, how wide a rows do you need in order to prevent canopy closure before you start losing yield from, too wide rows?
so did you hear
Yeah,
that?
so Yep, no, I absolutely. And so we'll kind of get into that, but to answer the question, we do see an effect due to this wide rows. We tested specifically 30 inches and 15-inch rows, and I'm not sure what you all use out there. We have a wide spectrum all the way from 7-inch drilled beams, 22, all the way to 30-inch beams here. So we have the full spectrum, but 30-inch rows does delay that canopy closure about 10 to 14 days than what we would see with 15-inch beams. And we do see a very significant amount of white mold increase in these 15-inch rows comparatively to 30. If you have the capacity and the equipment to move to 22s to kind of, get somewhere in between, then that's going to be good. You're still going to see that delaying of canopy closure, but you're still not going to see as much of a yield hit because of that. And I'll show some of that data here as far as management.
Right, I think that's the questions for the in-person.
Perfect.
Anybody online to have questions, feel free to unmute.
Okay, cool. Well, then I guess we'll jump right into management. And this is probably going to be the majority of this talk here, because we have a lot of data talking about management. So crop rotations is the easiest management strategy we have for most diseases. So we don't have to worry about it. And for white mold, for example, if I unpause this, there we go. So as I stated before, white mold does infect into 600 other different plant species. Again, being in your area, I'm sure that you do not deal with many of these crops here, but in our area, we have a lot of sunflower, canola, and dry beans grown commercially. All of these are very susceptible to white mold. And so these are different concerns we have to worry about in going into specific fields. There's also issues with all vegetable crops again as well. So anything that is a broadleaf is going to be susceptible to white mold. Okay. But for crop rotation, we do have some options, especially small grains. So wheat, oats, barley, and then corn. All of these are going to be able to not be infected by sclerotinia. And then also, as I think it was Lee mentioned, that these can oftentimes induce the formation of these apothecia outside of a soybean rotation. So these could be beneficial in a couple of different ways. The difficult part about this, though, is that these sclerotia are able to survive for up to 5 to 10 years. And so because of that, a long-term rotation may be feasible if you have an incredibly severe field. I've seen individuals plant into turf, actually, to just try to get out of this, or plant into fescue, or turn it into rangeland. But in the majority of cases across the Midwest, this is just not a feasible option for crop rotation, but it can help from year to year, just trying to break down that inoculum, as we talked about with majority of other pathogens and diseases. So the next one we talk about are going to be cultural practices. So the three that really going to focus on here are going to be seeding rate, the row spacings, and then fertility. Okay. And so in order to answer these questions, we had a very big integrated project. You can see the map here of all the locations across between 2017 and 2019, in which we looked at row spacings. So again, 15 and 30-inch rows, as stated earlier. 4 different seeding rates, so going from 110 up to 200,000 seeds per acre. And then we looked at 2 different fungicide programs. So what we call our standard, which was picoxystrobin or approach at R1 and R3. We had another application following our predictive models, and then we had non-treated in that as well. Okay. So when looking at seeding rate on white mold, on the left-hand side, so we're looking at the development of white mold, what we call our disease severity index, or DIX. There are these 4 seeding rates, and across the 140, 170, and 200, we saw a statistically significant increase in white mold development, with a decrease in this 110,000 seeds per acre. So the lower seeding rates are reducing white mold pressure, And the reason behind this is because when we have more plants in that field, we're having a denser stand, and that increased density is going to reduce the amount of airflow going through that canopy, maintaining a high level of humidity, especially after canopy closure. So if we can decrease that seeding rate, get a little bit more air through that crop, we can potentially decrease white. Then row spacings. So we saw an interaction, so we're showing this here between the 15-inch rows here on the left and the 30-inch rows on the right. The black bar is our non-treated. So this is what we would expect to be our highest amount of disease in both row spacings, which they are, which is great. And then our model program. Okay, so we only made applications when our predictive models told us to. And then our standard, which is again R1 and R3, so a 2-pass program in that particular crop. So overall, what we saw here, indicated by this A and this B, is that the wide rows were able to decrease white mold development. Again, looking at this non-treated bars between the 15 and the 30, okay? But we did see that the standard application was effective in reducing even further in each of these row spacings, but this model program was only effective in the 15-inch rows. These models we're still working on to further improve, or at least at this point, we've made some big improvements in those. Hopefully that's why we saw this response here. But overall, increased row spacing can decrease it, and then integrating in fungicide applications can further decrease white mold. However, with these traits, we do see a decrease in yield, which is very standard across a lot of other research done by agronomists. We do see that across the board that the 30-inch rows have lower yields than the 15-inch rows. We're just able to get more plants into more area, and then the photosynthetic capacity of those plants is higher in these narrow rows. Further, we saw that as we increased seeding rates, we saw increased yields. Now, that makes a lot of sense. We have more plants, we get more seed out. But in these 15-inch rows, we saw this kind of stepwise pattern. So these narrow rows, you need to have higher seeding rates, but in these 30-inch rows, it's looked much more stable. So, you know, there are going to be trade-offs. We have high white mold control in these conditions, but we're going to see lower yields. So if these are fields that we have severe white mold development, this is kind of what we would recommend for white mold, trying to increase it and decrease seeding rate at the same time. Then just to finish out this project here, looking at the fungicide applications. So again, at yield here, our standards. So again, the R1, R3 treatments increased yield comparatively to the non-treated and this model program, just as we would expect. But it is good to have that confirmation in these trials. So all of this is great, but we need to make sure that financially it also makes sense for managing this. So we did what we call a partial profit analysis. So it's only looking at either the cost of fungicide or the cost of seed, relating that to the grain that was harvested. So we did this at 3 different sale prices. So 15 bushels or $15 a bushel was considered our high, 12 and then $9 a bushel was considered our low when we did this analysis back in 2021. And so when we're first looking at these looking at the fungicide programs, due to the increased cost of the fungicides themselves, they did not pay for themselves at this $9 per bushel price point. But as soon as we got up to $12 per bushel, these fungicides started to pay for themselves. And specifically in the $15 bushels, that standard actually had increased profitability. Statistically the same, right? But still, we saw higher mean value than what we saw with the non-treated. Then looking at the seed.
Can I interrupt you? Wait.
Please do.
Your model, will that only give you 1 application versus your standard, which requires 2?
Nope. So it'll give you as many as you possibly can, depending. Okay. We try to recommend between 7 to 14 days for a subsequent application. But as long as there are still flowers present on that crop, that's when the model should be activated. Okay. So across the different locations that we did this trial at, there were multiple locations where we only had one application. There were locations where the model said don't spray at all through the entire season. And then there were a couple of locations where they did say to make 2 applications based off of those, the models and the environment driven from that.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. And so then looking at seeding right here on this partial profit, the big takeaway here is that this 2,000 seeds per acre in high white mold pressure environments, even though we saw higher yield, that increased cost of seed, and due to that white mold development, we actually saw it start to economically be similar to the low seeding rate at 110,000 seeds per acre. So there are trade-offs. Going high seeding rates are going to increase yield. And this is going into agronomy here, but again, trying to strike that balance. And so general takeaway, what we try to recommend is if you can, again, increase row spacing. If you can go to 22, great. You can just try to stay under 140. I'm not 100% sure what you all are recommended locally for your seeding rates, but I tell people that if you have problem fields, that try to seed it in about 120, and that can potentially decrease the amount of pressure that you have for white mold. So kind of continuing on with integrated management trials. So we, in our portion of the Midwest, we have a lot of dairies, and a lot of these dairy farmers, when they have their cows, they have a lot of manure that needs to get spread out in the fields. And so this manure, when it gets spread, it's typically right before a corn crop, but that leads to very high fertility soils for the subsequent year when we're planting back into beans. And so because of that, we wanted to understand if nitrogen, specifically nitrogen, or what we were just calling fertility, has an impact on the amount of white mold development. Okay. And so we made applications of urea at planting. It's not the best way to go about this, but again, it was just a quick and dirty way of trying to evaluate this effect of nitrogen on that soil. And these urea applications showed that we had an increased development of white mold development. Okay. The explanation for that here is that these crops are going to be healthier, they're going to be bigger, they're going to be bushier plants. So therefore, we had increased humidity with white mold development. So that was much more conducive microenvironment for that condition. So we always say that if you have a really good crop, that's a perfect year for white mold development. Okay. Other years, if you have really dry, really bad looking crops, white mold's probably not going to show up, okay, because of this kind of effect of very healthy plants going to create a good microenvironment for that. This work here also looked at seeding rates. We saw that.
We have a question here, wait.
Yep.
How much urea did you apply for your nitrogen application?
Yeah, so that I would need to double check, but I believe I don't know for sure. I can get you that number though. Otherwise, I will probably be wrong as far as the exact number, but it varied across locations. So this was again between Iowa, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And Michigan laid it on thick is what I remember, but I don't know the exact numbers on that. Yep. Sorry about that. So So again, seeding rate was looked at. We saw the exact same effect. Low seeding rates at 100,000 decreased white mold comparatively to 160. And then we also looked at different pesticide programs. So non-treated again on the right-hand side, we saw the highest amount of white mold. We saw a product that we is Lactofen, or Cobra is the trade name. That is actually an herbicide and a very interesting product and management strategy for white mold. Lactofen, it dings the beans just enough so that it delays canopy closure, and it's shown to increase the resistance level across the plant for a period of time. And so that has been an effective strategy for managing white mold as well. In some instances, as long as we do it right before flowering, because we don't want to have any of those flowers be aborted. And then also looking at boscalid or endura. Again, comparing our model or Sportcaster, and this was after our adjustments to it. We can see that these started to become much more similar, statistically the same as our standard R3 application.
Wait, I have a question here.
Yep.
I see that here you guys decided to use V5 and R3 only.
Yep.
What's the rationale? I can see the V5 maybe to start early and then you can cover that flowering maybe. Was that the intention there?
Yeah, so with lactofen, we want to make sure not to ding the flowers. So we try to do it right before those flowers is induced. Because if those flowers get exposed to lactofen, they will most often abort and will not see fill of those in pod formation. And then the R3 was just chosen because we have some further work, and I'll show this here at the end, is that R2 is actually the best growth stage to make these applications. But R3 is statistically just about the same as R2. R1 we don't see as great of control. So if we're going to make a single application, it's going to be between that R2 and R3 window. And just based off of the location of these trials, a lot of them were remote locations, and we didn't have personnel to make these applications. And so we had a lot of other trials going out at R3, and just for that sake, that's why we made this R3 application.
Thank you.
Yep. So just to kind of wrap this up here for the fertility, the cultural management strategies. This is the same exact trial here looking at fertility. Our base soil nitrogen is what we call without any of this urea applied. And then our high soil nitrogen here. And general takeaways from this is a little bit of a complex figure here, but with general takeaway is that this fertility under high fertility, okay, these plant populations can be reduced. And they can significantly reduce some of this white mold development as seen here within these trials. But one of our next questions, kind of continuing this story of trying to integrate in all of these different strategies together, is looking at genetic resistance and different varieties, seeing if we can further improve based off of these applications of fungicides as well as cultural practices, okay? So again, getting into genetic resistance is our third strategy for managing white mold. Across the board, you know, when you go and look at seed catalogs, as I'm sure all of you have done this past month or so, or before the holidays, you will see that many of these varieties show a spectrum of white mold resistance, if this is something you're paying attention to. You know, generally everything is considered to be susceptible. Moderately susceptible, moderately resistant, whatever you want to call it. Everything can develop white mold. And as seen in this picture here, these are a bunch of commercial lines that were evaluated back in Wisconsin. So these were a bunch of maturity group 1s and 2s. We can see across the board, everything got disease development. There were a few individual plants that were able to stand up and survive. But again, majority of them were very susceptible and ended up dying. So we need better varieties, okay? This is a difficult trait to breed in, but this was actually a part of my PhD dissertation, was to breed and develop specific varieties with high white mold resistance. And this is something I'm really excited about here. We have 4 varieties in this red box here on the right-hand side. This was our conventional soybean trials performed across Wisconsin. Across 23 and 22, these 3 lines are being released publicly in 24. So this year, I guess we are in 24 now, is their first release. And one of these specifically 165282B shows high yields and incredibly high resistance, moderate yields. So this is very exciting that we are able to integrate in resistance into lines that are agronomically favorable and commercially available. Okay. These figures here, these were some of our breeding populations The first one is our white mold intensity. This is a greenhouse trial that we had done screening these varieties, and our bottom one is a field trial. Our Dwight variety here is what we call our susceptible, very highly susceptible, gets absolutely hammered out in the field. And then again, our 5282B, the line that I pointed out that is getting released, is considered our resistant check. We have 3 other lines being released. So our Sock, Marathon, and Rock varieties. All 3 of these do demonstrate high levels of white mold resistance under both greenhouse and field conditions. We did many different studies across multiple generations to confirm that we do have high resistance. So when there are commercial varieties available saying that there are moderate resistance, that they can be pushed further. We can get almost zero disease development, as we can see in some of these lines here, such as Marathon and Sock. Okay, so it is possible to breed in resistance to white mold. It is just very laborious and it takes a lot of time. There are options. So again, just as a quick summary here, these are the 4 lines we're being released all across the 1.5 up to high 2 maturity groups. I think the highest is a 2.9, which is Columbia, or our 5282B. And then our 1, which is just kind of a fun little surprise, happened to be a black soybean. And just as a complete side note, black soybeans seem to be really interesting market in East Asia and Japan and Korea. And so we see this potentially being useful in some of these very organic, conventional food grade markets. So again, just very exciting that we are able to develop high levels of resistance, decent yields, and good agronomics in some of these traits or varieties. One of the other things to think about with variety selections is going to be the maturity date, or the maturity grouping. This is work done out of one of the research extension centers here at NDSU by Dr. Michael Wunsch. He is a plant pathologist by training, and he focuses almost all of his attention on white mold and optimization of fungicide applications. So he does a lot of the very technical work, does incredibly great work across the central portion of the state here. And so what we're looking at is multiple varieties across they're grouped into relative maturity. So we grow, and this may be shocking to many of you, but we grow varieties going down past 0 maturities and even into double zeros. These beans are incredibly quick to go from seed to seed, and the flowering period is very short. So as we increase with relative maturity, we see that flowering period increase in length. And as we see more flowering time, we see more potential for infection points, right? Just makes sense. And so we can see for our white mold development, we have our non-treated and then a single pass or a 2-pass of Endura. But for this slide, just focus on this no fungicide or non-treated plots. And we can see that as we progress up in maturity groups and relative maturities, we see this increase in white mold development, especially because of this increased flowering time associated with this relative maturity. So this is another consideration to think about. So knowing all of this, we had a big question of, can we integrate in resistance with fungicide applications? And so we performed these trials on 4 lines that we developed called our check lines. So they have standardized levels of resistance. Again, Dwight is what we consider our highly susceptible. 5282B from both greenhouse and field trials is highly resistant. And then we have one variety of 5170, which is moderate in the greenhouse, but in the field, which these trials are coming from, show almost 0 white mold development, regardless of environment and year. Okay. And so focus on here between the Dwight, our susceptible, and then 5282B, our highly resistant variety. So looking at white mold development here, we see our non-treated in black, and we see 5282B in black. And we can see that clear decrease in white mold development due to variety. Again, we know this is what we expected. But what's really good to see here is that when we fungicide applications using our standard application, or what we were trying to optimize some of these predictive models again at different thresholds, which is our low, moderate, and high. But let's just focus on this standard for right now. We see in Dwight, a susceptible variety, that these applications of fungicides increased or decreased white mold development. But in our resistant varieties, we did see a little drop in white mold development, but there wasn't much to lose to begin with. So we didn't see as much of a substantial effect due to fungicide applications, which is good to see. Then when looking at yield as well, we did see Dwight and 5282B across the board, again, at our non-treateds, yielded almost exactly the same, even though 5282B had good control. So that's great. We have resistance and high yielding. And we see this effect of fungicide applications slightly in some of these varieties. Okay. So general takeaways for genetic resistance here is that there are currently commercially very few varieties with high levels of resistance. There are some that are moderately resistant, okay, depending on what the different scales of resistance are for the company that you buy from. Lower maturity groups may result in lower white mold development, but as I'm sure many of you are growing anything, maybe around 2 to 3s, that these maturity groups may not have as much of an effect. But if you can drop that by about a maturity group, it would be interesting to see if you could decrease white mold compared to a higher maturity. And then finally, these highly resistant varieties, you could potentially get away from actually needing a fungicide application at all, strictly because of resistance. So choosing a right variety could help save yourself a bunch of money on that cost of applications, especially if you're using some of these higher end, more expensive products such as Endura or Boscalit, very effective products.
Hey, wait, I have a question.
Yes, jump in. Let's hear it.
In your experience, how easy is to find this information when we look at catalogs? You know, sometimes Phytophthora, SDS, SCN, you have that information readily available, and white mold, it's hard, clearly for the reasons you're showing here. But what is your approach when you actually want to know about this?
Yeah, so the approach is typically, and again, because of the geographical differences, we typically see white mold ratings in our seed catalogs here. I'm sure you all do as well, but if you don't, I'm sure that the rep, whoever you're talking with from those companies, will have an idea of resistance levels. The other thing to point out too is that plant architecture can also play a big role in genetic resistance, specifically again because of that microenvironment. So if you get a bushy type bean, increased bushiness is going to increase the humidity within that microenvironment. So if you want something that's as resistant as possible, is what you can is try to find something with a good white mold rating, find something that is a non-bushing bean, and something with potentially a lower maturity, I guess would be my general recommendation. Again, you're never going to have complete control with genetic resistance. Everything is still going to be able to develop white mold at some level, but trying to reduce the amount that's developing is the big point.
Hey, Wade, just for some reference,
Yeah.
what is your typical planting date in North Dakota and your average yields?
Yeah, so our state yield average, okay, and I will tell you this, but then I'll tell you the caveat associated with it. I think right now it's like 35 bushels across the state, but in the eastern portion here, in what we call the Red River Valley, I would say pretty consistently we're getting about 65 to 70 bushel beans across this region. A lot of this is very heavy, very high organic or heavy soil. We get a lot of moisture retention, and we have very high organic matter. But as we get into western portion of the state, everything's non-irrigated. There are growers that put their beans out and they're happy if they're getting 20 bushel beans. So our state average is a little low, but again, there's some caveats there as far as planting date, it can really vary depending on the winter. So like last year, we had up to 10 feet of snow in my front yard on April 15th. Okay. I couldn't get into the field until May 23rd. And my last plot got in on June 15th was my last plot. And I still got 65 bushel beans off of that June 15th trial, which absolutely ecstatic. And I don't know how I was able to do that, but the ground here is really great. This year though, we have hardly any snow, and with getting up to 45 degrees next week, all that snow is going to go away. And I potentially see that we can get into the field May 1st, which is what I'm used to. But again, it varies from year to year. So
Okay.
I wish we were a lot more stable. Make my job a little bit easier. So jumping into chemical control here. Okay, so this is going to be the bread and butter of white mold management. Okay, there's been so many resources, so many products available for controlling white mold as far as chemically. And I'm going to refer a lot of this material to what Michael Wunsch had done up at Carrington, again, broken up into 3 different sections here. The first one is going to be optimizing the timing of these fungicides in relation to the canopy closure as well as the grow staging. So these figures are going to be very complicated, and it takes me a very long time to process them, but I'm going to try to break it down as easily as I possibly can. Okay, so each of these trials here, you're going to see a number at the top. So this is what our comparison is between a mid to late R1 versus an early R2. So Michael has the capacity of where he works is in order to break down these growth stages by individual days. So he can go out, evaluate, and make applications at even shorter periods than just an individual growth stage, which is absolutely fantastic that he has this capacity here. In this particular case, we're looking at each dot here represents one field trial, and everything here is when the canopy closure was not occurring. Okay, so these trials are broken up and analyzed separately. When we saw that we were making applications at R1, when canopy closure was not present, okay, we did see a little bit of higher white mold than if we had waited until R2, when canopy closure was open. But in this same comparison here, and again, late R1 to early R2, if canopy closure was met, then we do see the same level of control at both R1 and R2. Okay, so by delaying those applications to try to target that canopy closure is going to be most important here in these instances. These next ones are looking at a mid to late R1 versus 100% R2. Okay. Even in the environments when we saw the canopy was still not closed or it was open, statistically, we did see the similar amount of white mold develop. And then same thing when we saw that the canopy was met at almost 100% canopy closure. Okay. So again, canopy closure, trying to wait as late as we possibly can, get close to that R2 growth stage. This next one here is looking at an early R2 versus a full R2. So early R2 is a little bit of again, it's very subjective in how we determine this, but an 80 to 99% of plants are at R2. Again, canopy is open. We saw exactly the same amount of white mold development and the exact same yields. Okay. Very similar things again when we had full canopy closure at these 2 R2 growth stages. So again, R2 seems to be the best growth stage in order to make these applications. So again, full flowering. And then finally, the last one here is going to be a full R2 versus an early R3. And so Horacio, this goes back to your question about that previous trials that we looked at. We can see again, R1 or R3 and R2 showing the same white mold level of control and the exact same yield across these different locations. Okay. So this is trying to answer when to make these applications. So if this canopy is closed at R1, this is when we want to time it. But if that canopy closure is still open, we want to wait until at least R2. If we reach R2, even if the canopy is not closed, we still want to make these applications. Okay, so it's kind of an if-then statement. So if we're at R1, but canopy is closed, make an application. Otherwise, wait until R2. Okay, any questions there, I guess? Okay, perfect. So the next one that Michael wanted to look at is the droplet size, trying to optimize, again, these fungicide applications from a very technical aspect. And so this is something that may be taught out in Ohio through the pesticide training programs, but the size of these droplets when we make these applications is going to be really important for coverage. So we can take this 500 micron droplet, divide it in half, that diameter in half, and we get 8 brand new droplets. We can make much greater coverage, as we can see here in this figure. So this is a particular leaf, that same droplet. If we divide that diameter in half and then divide it further in half into 125 microns, we can see we get full coverage of that entire leaf tissue, where we would only get one individual droplet on each leaf. Okay, so this is important because we want to get good coverage so that we can have proper management, as I'm sure many of you know from a weed science standpoint as well. However, because we are dealing with white mold and many of these apothecia are on the soil surface, and everything I just told you is wait until you have a dense canopy present. Some of these very low droplet sizes can be incredibly difficult to penetrate into that crop canopy. And so we can see in this figure here is that as these droplets get bigger, the speed at which they are moving coming out of that sprayer rig are going to be much faster the heavier they are. And that it just makes sense, right? Just simple dynamics here. So if we want to see some deep canopy penetration, we want to make sure that we have larger droplets, but we wanted to understand, and the big question of the study here that Michael was doing is at what droplet size category is going to be optimal at these different stages. And so Michael looked at 2 different, so both Wilger and T-Jet nozzles here. One thing that he kind of figured out here is that these droplet category sizes differ between the companies that you're working with, okay? And so this category for droplet size between fine and all the way up to very coarse is going to be different from T-Jet here, with fine up to coarse droplets. Okay. This is just kind of how he makes his applications up in Carrington. Attaches half a boom, then he applies it with tractor, driving at the exact same speed that we typically would in a production system, trying to replicate that as realistically as possible, making these spray volumes between 15 gallons per acre here. Again, showing more pictures of their operation up there. And so from this work here, again, incredibly complicated, but I'm going to try to break this down as easily as possible here. So we have white mold severity index, okay, as a percentage, and then we see soybean yield here. Each one of these CBC are non-treated, are fine droplets, medium droplets, medium coarse, and all the way up to coarse. These are just T-Jets here. Okay. We also was broken up into different canopy closure regimes, and then based off of varieties at specific locations. For this, what we're really going to focus on is going to be this combined analysis here. Okay. So looking at white mold development, we see that across the board that these medium droplets, you know, the medium fine all the way up to coarse statistically were the same, but we had the lowest amount of disease in the medium and statistically the highest amount of yield in the medium droplets, again, when canopy closure was not occurring. Okay. So again, because we didn't have that canopy, these medium droplets are able to penetrate and get down to that soil surface and protect that crop, protect the flowers. But when we start to see canopy closure occurring, okay, almost 100% in some of these locations or in conditions, we do see that in the overall combined analysis that these coarse droplets had the greatest amount of white mold control as well as the highest yield, okay, which again makes sense. The more canopy closure there is, the coarser these droplets are so that they can penetrate into that canopy. So these are all considerations to be thinking about when we get out to that field. Exact same thing when every one of these varieties and location were at 100% closure. Again, showing that same trend. Coarse droplets are optimal for the T-jets. Okay, so as a summary for T-jets, again, coarse droplets, if we're making applications when canopy closure is not occurring, or when canopy closure is occurring, sorry, and then using the median droplet size when canopy closure has not occurred yet. So that canopy is still open. Okay, now we're looking at the Wilger nozzles here. Again, same thing, these canopy closure has not occurred yet at these different varieties and locations. And so you see this reflection of all droplet sizes, even up to fine droplets through this manufacturer here, showing same level of control. And we start to see the median droplets again showing the medium, coarse, and very coarse all having statistically the same amount of yield. Okay. When we do get up to the 100% canopy closure, though, again, same level of control, but for yield specifically, we do see greatest within these very coarse. So non-statistically significant here, but we are seeing this benefit here according to yield in this location. So again, very, very quick summary of this particular work is that the very coarse droplets, again, are going to be important when canopy closure is occurring, and coarse droplets for when that canopy closure has not occurred yet. So pointing out here again that the droplet size categories are going to be different depending on your manufacturer, wherever you're getting the nozzles from, okay? So these are things just to pay attention to, but overall coarse for when we have canopy closure, and we can potentially go down to medium droplet size when we are looking at some open canopies. The next one, and this one I believe is a little bit shorter for chemical control, is going to be optimizing the frequency and the interval. So we're going to show some data here that we had already looked at earlier with genetic resistance. We're going to look again at the application timing. So either a single application or a two-pass program at these different maturity groups or relative maturities. So focusing on these double zeros, as I'm sure many of you are not going to be growing, I would hope not, but you will not see an effect due to fungicide applications at all for yield, only a slight decrease in disease development. But as we start to increase on these relative maturities, specifically in the 0.3 up to the 1s, we do see that there is a yield benefit due to a two-pass program. And focusing on these 1 to 1.3s, which is more similar, still not similar at all, but more similar to what you all are dealing with. We do see that we're seeing about a 4 bushel yield advantage due to a two-pass program. And so using Endura, which again is probably going to be about $30, $35 per acre, that's going to pay for itself in that application right there if we're going to see a 4 bushel advantage. Okay. And 6% decrease in white mold development as well within that canopy. So a two-pass program can be effective, okay, in these locations. And these were all the first applications were applied at the early R2. Again, just like what was stated earlier, is that we want to wait for that R2 growth stage in order to make these first applications. And then the second application was roughly 2 weeks after, okay, following that first application. And I will note that this data is coming out of a white mold block. So this is where we do our white mold research. So this information here is for fields that have severe white mold pressure. Okay. If you have moderate to very, very few white mold hits every year, a 2-pass program may not be beneficial in your particular situation. But this is talking about an extreme, a very severe white mold field. Okay.
Hey, wait, I have a question. Based
Yep.
on your experience, maybe to reduce some cost, Endura followed by another fungicide maybe that it's less expensive or vice versa. Would you recommend, or did you test something similar?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we're getting into right here, actually, with these fungicide trials. I'll show you a lot of information, a lot of different products here, because I know Endura again is very expensive from a price standpoint. So, if I don't answer your question, Horacio, though, after these, just let me know. I'll try to answer that. So.
Okay.
We have these, what we call our uniform fungicide trials, and I think this is what Horacio was trying to actually get involved in next year with potentially some of you all too in your region, is that we have these collaborative fungicide trials we do across the upper Midwest looking at fungicide products and programs efficacy for white mold control. So this data is off of 5 different locations. Multiple different programs, so different products, different timings, and different application strategies. Okay. The green bars represent our disease development or disease severity index, and yellow bars here represent our yield. And this is a really good way of, I'm really excited how this data turned out because we can see this clear trend that as disease increases, our yield clearly decreases. We see that very positive correlation with that. Okay, or I guess the negative correlation. So first, I'm going to point out our non-treated here. So as we would expect, this is the highest amount of disease with one of the lowest amount of yields. Okay, so that's great. We have really great, our high levels of disease develop across these locations. And then again, this is our standard, our Endura 2-pass program, a late R1, or what you could argue and say early R2, followed by an R3 application. Okay. So there's a lot of information right here. This is something that we can share with Horacio to share with you all. I know that many of you in the back of the room may not be able to read these individual product labels here. But one of the interesting products that we've been looking at here is Omega. It is not a new product here. Omega is more of a contact fungicide though. And so we have been, we've been looking at applying it under canopy. Again, from a production standpoint, this probably is not going to be feasible, but what we were doing is having drop nozzles into the canopy, spraying a 360 dome essentially around the canopy to protect these flowers and get that product onto those flowers. And we saw some pretty substantial decreases, statistically exactly the same as our gold standard of Endura 2-pass program. Other ones that are also effective, Delaro Complete has a lot of potential as well if applied at the correct time point. I would say it's a little more inconsistent across locations. And then our Cobra treatments, this was one that we had applied. We've known Cobra for a while, has been an effective management strategy, not as effective as others. But if we compare that with Topsin or T-methyl, okay, we can get good control. So again, Cobra at V5 and then Topsin followed at R3. Okay, so there are a lot of different products and programs here that we've evaluated. We have a lot of really great data over these 5 site years or environments to help make these recommendations as far as products go. Okay. Again, you will notice there's no complete control. These fungicides are reducing the amount of disease. Okay, you're still going to see white mold develop in some of these fields. So remember and try to understand how much yield you would have lost if you didn't make applications or if you made a different application program. Okay. Any big outstanding questions on chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, anything?
So yeah, I have a question. Wait, so
Yep.
how big are these trials? How much it takes out of a farm? How big are your plots? Do you
Yeah,
use
so
any machine to apply, or you go with backpack? How do you do it?
yeah, so all of these trials are small plots. You know, we've done a lot of strip trials as well with some of the better products that we've identified through here. So all of our trials are, you know, depending on what you're planting with, right? We're doing four row, 30-inch rows, so it's 10 feet wide, 20 feet long. Everything's replicated 4 to 6 times in each of these locations. All applications are being made with a backpack sprayer. Usually they are the maximum rate for each of these products that we're looking at. Everything's around 20 gallons per acre for application. Trying to think what else. Typically trying to get that coarse droplet size again within each of these locations. So, you know, very reasonable, you know, across the board. So if we're doing, I think it was 16 treatments at 4 reps. So that would be 64 plots, 200 square feet, whatever that is. It's around probably a half an acre, I'd think. So it's absolutely feasible. I mean, a lot of us do it. They're just probably a little bit of coordination and trying to make sure we're getting the trial in one of these hot spots for white mold so that we get good, consistent data.
Wade, I saw that you, in your last graph, you had Head Start. Have you looked at any other biological controls like Contans or some other
Yeah. Yeah, really, really, really great question. And so I do have that actually at the end. But I will just quickly summarize. So I guess with Contan specific, Heads Up is a derivative from a quinoa-like plant. It's a saponin. The thought there is that this saponin triggers what we call systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. Heads Up can the belief is that early in the season that this product can trigger this plant to have increased resistance overall to everything. The challenge with Heads Up that we've seen is that this resistance does not last until the flowering stages. As you can imagine, it takes, you know, a month and a half. Hopefully we can get a seed in the ground long enough to get these beans to flowering, and that effect is going to be gone. I know that there is a lot of other information about this Heads Up product, but again, this is just the data that we have for this particular product. The other biologicals, though, so there are a lot. There's double nickel, which is a bacillus species, howler. There's one Contans that you brought up, Lee, I believe. And so these are all products that we are actively testing right now. Contans specifically is a product that has been around for a while, and it is a parasitic fungus. And this fungus, what it does is it infects into the sclerotia, eating away at the sclerotia, making sure that they are no longer viable. It is an incredibly costly product, and it needs to be incorporated almost immediately when applied. So there are some logistical issues with application and making sure that it is an effective management strategy. But it is highly effective when all of those conditions are met. So,
Great, thanks.
yep. And, you know, based off of that, like I said, we are doing trials. So hopefully in a few years, even if Horacio might want to get involved in some of these trials too, that could be something that we see and integrated into some of our other strategies, whether that be tank mixing some of these biologicals or having seed treatments along with some other non-traditional applications, something like that. So now we're going to get into these predictive models. This is a little bit data science heavy, kind of a little bit. I'll try to keep it moving here. But these predictive models, the thought is that we want to take what we consider the disease triangle, understand the environmental conditions that are important for these apothecia to form, and convert it into a tool so that everyone can use with a couple of clicks of a button. You're not taking your time out of your day to pull up different websites and understand. It'd have a lot of inputs you have to look at. And so this was work done by Dr. Jamie Wilbur up at Michigan State University, developed these two different models, or these mathematical equations here at the top, whether it's you're planting into a non-irrigated field or an irrigated field. So what these models do is they help predict if these apothecia are going to be present, which is what we're trying to make fungicide applications off of. And so when we see this from my side of the equations, we put in all of our weather data, and we get this black line, which is our daily risk probabilities. And so as the season moves, these probabilities, the risk levels of these apothecia forming will increase and decrease. And I put these arrows between R1 and R4. So again, where the flowers are going to be present for this particular location in Northwest Iowa. And so we have set what we call our action threshold at 40%, meaning that if that black line were to reach above that yellow action threshold during that flowering period, that's when it would trigger a warning and say, hey, you need to go make a fungicide application because the environment is conducive for this, okay? Based off of those those models, we turn this into an app, okay, called Sporecaster. So this app is completely free. There's another version of this as well that's called Field Profit app, which is also completely free. Field Profit also looks at ParSpot applications and predictive models too. But what these models do is they help get a field specific location. So if, say, you have a field in location A, you have another field 10 miles down the road, those are going to have different environments. They're going to have different weather conditions. And so you're going to have different risk levels associated with them. And so this tool can give you very field specific information about risk levels of these apothecial formation. And currently we do see an accuracy of about 80%, which is the way I try to describe it is that we have historically either made applications year in and year out, or we don't make them, or we do a coin flip to determine if we may make an application this year. So I think that 80% is much better than a 50% coin flip, okay? But we are continuing to improve this and have more data inputted into this to improve these models even further. And so I'm just going to walk you through very quickly what these Sporecaster models look like. Okay, so this is the front-facing screen. If we click New Field, we'll click on the map and we can scroll over to whatever field you're looking at. There was one particular research site we had just north of Marshfield, Wisconsin, where we knew every year we got white mold. And so we're going to type in the name of that field. It's going to ask us what row spacing we had. So in this case, I believe it was 30, and then irrigation, whether or not you were using it or not. So yes, we were, again, more moisture. Then it's going to ask if flowers are present, again, between the R1 to R3 growth stage, and did you reach row closure? If you say yes, based off of these two images here, then it'll allow you to run the model. Okay. So we click yes, and we're going to adjust this to July 15th of 2022 from when I recorded this, and then we're going to click run model. And so off of this location and date, we see that we have a 3.5% or low risk level for this location because it's irrigated. So we're going to back out, go to our field list, and go click on our map at the bottom so we can see across a map here where the different fields that we have pinned. And we're going to go to Oaks, where we'd have our white mold research trials at. Okay. Again, we have our flowers present, so we're going to click yes. We have a row closure, going to click yes. So same exact date, July 15th of 2022. And then we're going to click run model. And in this particular location, we see we have a high risk of these apothecial formation. So this is what's going to help guide these recommendations of when to make these fungicides sprays. Then biological control. So again, this was already brought up, but we'll kind of tap into this. And I'm going to use a few slides from one of my colleagues at Purdue, Darcy Talenko, who's the field crop extension pathologist there as well. She has a student currently that's working on biologicals that is a little bit further along than the other biological testing groups. Okay. And just kind of as a quick rundown, so the biologicals are typically either bacteria or fungi that we will make applications into the field. Occasionally, these will be other viruses or other types of microscopic organisms. And some of the very common ones that we apply are two bacteria, are Bacillus and Pseudomonas. And then two very common fungi are Trichoderma species or Conitherium, which is what we call contans. Okay. So based off of these, why exactly are these biologicals going to be, why is there interest in these biologicals, right? So one is that they're an alternative method. Chemical products we're seeing in some systems that we're seeing the development of resistance starting to appear, such as in a frog eye leaf spot, we're seeing a lot of QOI resistance, and so we want alternatives to that. Additionally, we see that these biologicals are also less toxic. So again, they are biologicals, they are natural in their products, but they are still effective. And generally, there's no re-entry interval for a lot of these biologicals, which can be beneficial in some systems, right? A lot of these biologicals are also very targeted, meaning that they will only attack specific pathogens, such as contans with sclerotinia. And then they're also relatively small, or they're effective in small quantities. And that's primarily because these bacteria or fungi can reproduce in the soil. So if you make these applications, they can grow, they can increase their own quantities naturally so that we don't need to over apply, such as we might with some of these chemical products. And so this is a few images here of contans. Like I said, contans is an older product. It's been around for a while, and it's shifted hands in different companies multiple times. I believe currently it's with SipCam, but I'm not 100% sure. I know that Bayer had it for a little bit, but somebody else had acquired contans recently. So this figure at the top is looking at Sclerotinia blight and peanut, and I believe this was in North Carolina these trials were performed. Looking at a control, which is our non-treated, and then the number of years in which the contans was applied. And so across these, we do see a reduction in the quantity of disease development of Sclerotinia blight. This is a very similar but different pathogen. Both Sclerotinia species, they are both forming of the sclerotia, and the concept is the same, except the sclerotia are much smaller. Okay, so we have to use the microscope's images to show these different sclerotia. The one on the left here is completely healthy. We don't see any imperfections on these other than these wrinkles on the surface of the sclerotia. But when we apply contans, this fungus, in which it is contans, is infecting and growing into the sclerotia, eating away at all of the resources, the energy that the sclerotia has built, essentially making it no longer viable. And so we can see this imaging here too. At the surface level of the sclerotia, this is what it looks like with all these tiny little nodules. And then in the infected side, we see again this contans fungus is eating away, completely disrupting that surface of the sclerotia. Okay, so biologically, that's what this product is doing. So again, contant is a fungus, just like Sclerotinia, just like a lot of our other pathogens, but it's only able to eat and degrade these sclerotia as we know of right now. And this, again, this is contans, but I believe it is with SipCams currently. Another product here is what we call double nickel, or is the trade name of this product. This one is a bacteria, though, called Bacillus species. This one, again, is controlling the development of disease. This species is able to produce a compound that it releases, and it slows down this mycelia, hopefully trying to disrupt the apothecial formation or the spores that are germinating onto flower tissues. Okay. So that was biological controls. Again, there are many more products that are becoming available. Biologicals are a very hot topic right now as far as white mold management across the board for disease management. So this is stuff that we are looking into, trying to get a handle on of what's going to work and what's not going to work. Okay. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about here is going to be tillage. And tillage is one of these control mechanisms that is a little inconsistent across the literature, but generally, this is kind of believed to be true for the degradation and control of sclerotia. So this is a little figure I've used for teaching before, in which we're seeing a soil profile, and we're seeing after harvest, these sclerotia are present on the topsoil of this field. Okay, so this is within the top, I don't know, 10 inches or so, or sorry, to 10 centimeters. So the very high fertility, very active microbial communities. And then this is going to be the deep soil horizons. We have much more stable temperatures, less diverse communities of bacteria and microbes. And the first thing that we're going to look at is no-till. So no-till is obviously really important for soil health and soil conservation in a lot of different systems. And so there has been work, specifically 2 different papers, and one very recently that came out showing that no-till can actually prevent these sclerotia from degrading. Okay, they're exposed to the environment. They're not directly near all of the microbes and the most active of these microbes that are present in the soil. And so these sclerotia are able to survive and produce apothecia during the next season. But if we use tillage, these sclerotia are going to be integrated. If we can do light tillage, okay, integrate them into that topsoil, then they are going to be in contact with these bacteria, these other fungi. They're going to be able to break them down. So they have potential. They're able to be broken down. It takes a couple of years, okay, to do this. So this is not going to be a quick fix. But if we know we have a severe white mold field, it could be something that we do right before rotating into another crop. So say you're going into corn for 2 years. Again, my soil science colleagues are going to be incredibly upset with me, but doing some sort of tillage in these locations may have some sort of benefit for the degradation of the sclerotia. That doesn't mean, though, that we're not going to have white mold develop in future years. So again, one of these sclerotia here, I still put apothecia because they can still produce it, even if we do some tillage. The next one, which I hope many of you are not doing anymore, but plowing fields, specifically with moldboard plowing, these can bury the sclerotia under the soil. Okay, again, outside of that active topsoil range, and these sclerotia can survive again 5 to 10 years. So if we plow them under, and then 5 years later we come back and we plow them right back up to the surface, okay, these sclerotia are going to be able to form apothecia again. Okay, so that is one of the again kind of historical aspects to sclerotinia management, but light tillage generally is believed to have an effect on that after a couple of years. And so that's kind of what I have today for white mold management. You know, we went through a lot today. A lot of cultural practices, genetic resistance, chemical application, and different optimization of that, biologicals, and then tillage. Again, I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't say this, but every bit of this data here is coming from multiple people, multiple programs, multiple states. Okay, so as you saw, this is a lot of research. We have a lot of resources available for white mold management, and we have really great colleagues that are able to be supportive and worked together really well to put our resources together and do a lot of really great work. So thank you. Thanks, Horacio, for helping set this up, and to the Soybean Council out there in Ohio, for you all for showing up. I know you all are dealing with white mold right now, so I'd love to see that you're, I guess, taking advantage of getting into the wintertime, trying to figure this stuff out, and let me talk with you for a little bit.
Well, thanks, Wade, for joining us. I do have one question on tillage while it's on the top of my head. What about the timing of tillage? So I'm assuming a fall tillage would increase the survival of the sclerotia because you're burying a little bit and you're not going to lose some winter degradation. So is it spring tillage better than fall tillage, or am I wrong on that assumption?
So it really doesn't matter as far as what we know. You know, we don't have enough data, I guess, to say definitively one way or the other. The wintering, the degradation on the surface is not really, it doesn't have much of an impact. You know, these sclerotia, they are tough little buggers. The best way to degrade them is get them in that soil, especially in that springtime. You know, we have a lot of the snow melt. If they're sitting in flooded soils, that's going to degrade them even further than if they're sitting on that soil surface. So, you know, thinking about it that way, fall tillage seems more advantageous than it would be spring tillage. So from a biological standpoint, that's where we're at. As far as practicality of that and making sure that we're actually able to do that is a different story. So,
Thanks.
yep.
Other question for Wade?
Yeah, well, but thank you very much,
Cool.
Wade. It was
Oh,
very,
absolutely.
yeah, we appreciate your time. And
Yeah, man.
we may come up with more questions later after our discussion.
Yeah, shoot Horacio an email if you have anything, and he'll connect with you and get you guys anything you need. I'm here for you. So,
Thank
all
you.
right. Yep, absolutely. Have a good one.
Thanks, Wade.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Very good. What do you think?
Thanks, everybody else, for joining.